Solomon Islands, April 6, 1945, 0300 hours, and Lieutenant Commander Yukio Saki's ghost must have been watching from whatever afterlife awaited kamikaze pilots as 355 of his spiritual successors prepared to launch from airfields across southern Kyushu. Their Mitsubishi A6M0s and an assortment of other aircraft loaded with bombs, extra fuel tanks, and the weight of Japan's desperate final strategy, because this was Operation Kikusui No. 1, the first of 10 massive kamikaze attacks that would rain down on the American fleet off Okinawa. And in the pre-dawn darkness, these young pilots, most with barely 40 to 50 hours of flight training compared to the 700 hours their predecessors had enjoyed in 1941, performed their final ceremonies, drinking sake and eating rice, carrying their katana swords and precious family photographs that would accompany them into death. The Imperial Japanese Navy had reached this point through a cascade of disasters that began at Midway, accelerated through the Marianas Turkey Shoot, and culminated in the systematic destruction of Japanese naval aviation, where experienced pilots who once terrorized the Pacific in their Zeros at 331 miles per hour were now replaced by boys who could barely keep their aircraft flying straight, let alone engage in combat maneuvers, and Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the architect of the kamikaze program, understood that conventional tactics were no longer possible when your enemy's Grumman F-6F Hellcats were achieving a 19-to-1 kill ratio against the Zero, when the Americans had radar-guided combat air patrols, when their pilots had hundreds of hours of training compared to Japan's 7-day crash course in how to crash. The Mitsubishi A6M0, which had once been the terror of the Pacific, climbing at 3,090 feet per minute and dancing through the sky with unmatched maneuverability, was now revealed as a death trap with no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and no chance against the American fighters that prowled at 380 miles per hour, waiting to pounce on anything that dared approach the fleet, and the Japanese pilots knew this, understood that their Zero fighters, even the latest A6M5 variants struggling to reach 351 mph, were hopelessly outclassed, which is precisely why Operation Ketsugo, Japan's final defensive plan for the homeland, called for converting every available aircraft into a guided missile with a human brain as its guidance system. Captain Rikibi Inaguchi, Navy Chief of Staff of the 1st Air Fleet, would later testify that the kamikaze concept emerged not from high command but from the pilots themselves, from men who watched their friends being slaughtered by American fighters and realized that if they were going to die anyway, they might as well take an enemy ship with them, and this grim mathematics made sense when you considered that a conventional attack might lose 20 aircraft to sink one ship, while 20 kamikazes might sink 5 or 6 vessels, assuming they could penetrate the American Combat Air Patrol, assuming they could survive the wall of anti-aircraft fire, assuming their poorly trained pilots could actually hit a moving target while diving at speeds that threatened to tear their aircraft apart. The German military attaché in Tokyo, watching these preparations with a mixture of horror and fascination, cabled Berlin that the Japanese had found a way to turn their greatest weakness into a weapon, transforming inexperienced pilots who couldn't dogfight into guided bombs that didn't need to dogfight, and the Luftwaffe veterans who had faced American P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts over Europe understood the desperation that drove such tactics, having witnessed their own fighter force, ground down by superior American technology and numbers, watching helplessly as waves of bombers escorted by fighters that could fly from England to Berlin and back demolished the Third Reich's war machine. In Rome, what remained of the Regia Aeronautica leadership, now flying American hand-me-down P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs as part of the Allied Italian co-belligerent Air Force, received intelligence reports about the kamikaze attacks with disbelief, remembering their own desperate battles against American fighters over Sicily and Italy, where their Macchi C-202s and C-205s, excellent aircraft in their own right, were overwhelmed by sheer numbers and superior American tactics, and they understood what it meant when an air force reached the point where suicide became strategy, where death became the only path to honor. The morning of April 6, 1945 brought clear skies over Okinawa, perfect flying weather for both hunters and hunted, and as the first wave of kamikazes approached the American fleet, climbing to 25,000 feet before their final descent, the radar operators on the picket destroyers began calling out contacts, vectors, and speeds to the Combat Air Patrol, primarily composed of F-6F Hellcats from the Fast Carrier Task Force, aircraft that could climb at 3,420 feet per minute, nowhere near what would soon be possible but still superior to anything the Japanese could field, and these Hellcats, with their 650 caliber machine guns, their armor plating, their self-sealing fuel tanks, represented everything the Zero was not, everything the kamikaze pilots would have to penetrate to reach their targets. The Japanese had developed specific tactics for these attacks, with experienced pilots flying escort for the kamikazes, guiding them to the target area because most of these suicide pilots couldn't navigate on their own, having received only 7 days of training that covered takeoff, basic formation flying, and how to aim at a ship, nothing about combat maneuvering, nothing about evasion, nothing about survival because survival was not part of the mission. And when the American fighters appeared, these escorts would engage them, trying to clear a path for the kamikazes while the suicide planes dropped to 240 to 270 feet, using the radar ground clutter to mask their approach, then climbing to 3,000 meters for their final dive. Flying Petty Officer First Class Isao Matsuo, one of the kamikaze pilots in that first massive wave, had written to his parents the night before, "Please congratulate me. I have been given a splendid opportunity to die. This is my last day." And as his Zero approached the American fleet at 3,000 meters, he could see the wall of anti-aircraft fire rising to meet him, the black puffs of 5-inch shells, the streams of 40mm and 20mm tracers creating a seemingly impenetrable barrier between him and his target, and he pushed his control stick forward, beginning his final dive at an angle calculated to maximize speed, while maintaining enough control to adjust his aim. The American destroyer USS Bush was in Matsuo's path, part of the radar picket line that formed the fleet's early warning system, and her crew watched in horror as the Zero, despite taking multiple hits that tore chunks from its wings and fuselage, continued its dive, the pilot visible in the cockpit, hunched forward over his controls, and at the last second, the destroyer's captain ordered full speed ahead and hard right rudder. But the kamikaze adjusted, slamming into the ship's superstructure in a ball of flame that killed dozens instantly and left the Bush burning and listing, eventually to sink with heavy loss of life. 22 kamikazes penetrated the combat air patrol that day, sinking 6 ships and damaging 18 others, and Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, receiving the reports at his headquarters in Guam, understood that this was just the beginning, that Operation Olympic, the planned invasion of Kyushu scheduled for November 1, 1945, would face not hundreds but thousands of these attacks, with Japanese planners preparing 6,000 kamikaze aircraft plus another 5,000 that could be converted, and his staff estimated that even with current defenses, the Navy could expect 95 ships sunk and 995 damaged, with 5,000 to 12,000 sailors killed, numbers that made the atomic bomb seem like a merciful alternative. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine that powered the Hellcat was a magnificent piece of engineering, producing 2,000 horsepower that could push the fighter to 376 miles per hour. But even this wasn't enough to guarantee interception of every kamikaze, especially when they came in massive waves, saturating the defenses, and the Navy desperately needed something faster, something that could climb higher and quicker, something that could reach the kamikazes before they began their final dives. And, unknown to the Japanese, that something was already in production at Grumman's Bethpage factory on Long Island, where workers were assembling the first F-8F Bearcats, fighters that would revolutionize carrier aviation if they could just arrive in time. The story of the Grumman F-8F Bearcat began not in a boardroom or a Pentagon office but at Pearl Harbor on June 23, 1942, when Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch, inventor of the famous Thatch Weave that helped F-4F Wildcats survive against Zeros, sat down with Grumman Vice President Jake Swerble and emphasized that climb rate was the single most important characteristic a fighter could possess, because getting altitude advantage meant controlling the engagement, meant life or death in the Pacific, and Swerble took this advice back to Bethpage where Grumman's engineers, led by the brilliant Bill Schwendler, began working on a radical concept of wrapping the smallest possible airframe around the most powerful available engine, creating a hot rod of the skies that would make every other piston fighter obsolete. By November 1943, the design was finalized, and on August 21, 1944, test pilot Bob Hall took the XF-8F-1 prototype into the air for its maiden flight, and what happened next sent shockwaves through the naval aviation community, because this compact fighter, 5 feet shorter than a Hellcat and 7 feet less in wingspan, rocketed skyward at 4,800 feet per minute, reaching 10,000 feet in just 94 seconds after a takeoff run of only 115 feet, numbers that seemed impossible, that violated everything pilots knew about the relationship between power and weight. And when Hall pushed the throttle forward in level flight, the Bearcat accelerated past 424 miles per hour, making it the fastest Navy fighter ever tested. The Japanese intelligence services, despite their network of spies and informants, Had no idea what was coming, no knowledge that Grumman had taken everything learned from the F4F Wildcat and F6F Hellcat and distilled it into something that weighed 20% less than a Hellcat while carrying the same Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, now designated the R2834W and producing 2,100 horsepower, driving a massive 4-blade propeller that required long landing gear, giving the Bearcat its distinctive nose-high stance that looked aggressive even sitting still on the carrier deck. And this wasn't just another incremental improvement but a quantum leap in performance that would have changed everything about the Pacific Air War. In Germany, the Luftwaffe was fighting its own desperate battle against American fighters, and pilots like Gunther Rahl, who had captured and flown American P-51 Mustangs, were shocked at their performance, their ability to dive without breaking apart, their range that allowed them to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, and when intelligence reports about the F-8F Bearcat filtered through, the Germans realized the Americans had created something even more formidable, a fighter that combined the Mustang's speed with unprecedented climb performance, and Luftwaffe technical experts calculated that such an aircraft could intercept their Me-262 jets during their vulnerable takeoff and landing phases, when the jet's speed advantage disappeared. The Italian Air Force veterans, now flying surplus American fighters, understood viscerally what superior technology meant in aerial combat, having experienced it from the wrong end when their Macchi C-202 Falgors, excellent fighters by any standard, were overwhelmed by American P-38 Lightnings and P-47 Thunderbolts over Sicily, and when they heard about the Bearcat's performance specifications through Allied channels, they recognized it as the ultimate evolution of piston engine fighter design, the absolute pinnacle of what could be achieved before jets made everything else obsolete, and they wondered how different the war might have been if Italy had possessed such aircraft in 1943. VF-19, the first squadron to receive the F-8F Bearcat, began operations on May 21, 1945, at Naval Air Station Alameda in California, and the pilots transitioning from Hellcats couldn't believe the difference, with Lieutenant Mike Haddon later recalling that flying the Bearcat after the Hellcat was like switching from a truck to a race car. Everything happened faster, the controls were lighter and more responsive, and that incredible climb rate meant you could be at 20,000 feet before you finished your second cup of coffee, performance that would have been perfectly suited for intercepting kamikazes approaching at high altitude before they began their deadly dives toward the fleet. The mathematics of kamikaze interception were brutal and unforgiving, because once a suicide plane began its final dive from 3,000 meters, you had perhaps 90 seconds to destroy it before impact, and with Hellcats needing nearly 3 minutes to climb from sea level to 10,000 feet, the margin for error was razor thin, but the Bearcat could make that climb in 94 seconds, could be vectored by radar to intercept kamikazes while they were still in level flight, still vulnerable, still possible to destroy without risking the fleet, and this capability would have transformed the defensive equation around Okinawa and during Operation Olympic. The Battle of Okinawa raged through April, May, and June of 1945, with 10 major kamikaze attacks involving nearly 2,000 suicide planes, and the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet suffered the worst losses in its history, with 36 ships sunk and 368 damaged, nearly 5,000 sailors killed and another 5,000 wounded, and destroyer crews on radar picket duty knew they were the primary targets, the first line of defense that would absorb the brunt of the attacks, and they watched the combat air patrol struggle to intercept every incoming raid, saw Hellcats and Corsairs diving desperately to catch kamikazes that had already begun their final runs, often arriving too late to prevent impacts that turned ships into funeral pyres. Commander John Thatch, whose tactical innovations had helped American pilots survive the early war period when the Zero ruled the skies, developed new defensive strategies including the Big Blue Blanket, positioning fighters at multiple altitudes around the fleet, but even these improvements couldn't completely stop the kamikazes, especially when they came in coordinated waves designed to saturate the defenses, and Thatch knew that what the fleet really needed was an interceptor that could climb like a rocket, something that could reach attack altitude before the enemy even knew they were being hunted, and that was exactly what his conversation with Grumman had helped create in the F-8F Bearcat. The Japanese kamikaze pilots, most of whom were conscripts by mid-1945 rather than volunteers, flew to their deaths with a mixture of sake-fueled bravado and bitter resignation, knowing they were being sacrificed in a war already lost, and one pilot actually strafed his own command post after takeoff in a final act of rebellion before heading out to sea, while others simply disappeared into the ocean without ever reaching their targets, their navigational skills so poor they couldn't find the American fleet even with escort pilots guiding them, And these were the pilots who would have faced Bearcats climbing at 4,465 feet per minute, intercepting them at altitudes where the Zero's performance was marginal at best. The F-8F-1B variant, armed with 4 20mm cannons instead of the standard 450 caliber machine guns, was specifically developed in response to the kamikaze threat, because the Navy realized that stopping a determined suicide attacker required more hitting power, more destructive capability to ensure the aircraft was not just damaged but destroyed, blown apart before it could reach its target. And these cannon-armed Bearcats would have been devastating against Japanese aircraft that had no armor protection, no self-sealing fuel tanks, nothing to prevent them from exploding into flames when hit by high-explosive shells. On Kyushu, Japanese commanders were preparing for Operation Ketsugo, the defense of the homeland that would throw every available aircraft against the American invasion fleet, and by August 1945 they had assembled bomb stockpiles including 3,100 kilograms bombs, 7,250 kilograms bombs, 3,500 kilograms bombs, and 800 kilograms bombs, all designated for kamikaze use, weapons that would turn obsolete trainers, worn-out fighters, and even biplane crop dusters into guided missiles, because when you're defending the sacred homeland, when you're facing national extinction, even a wood and fabric Yokosuka K-5Y trainer becomes a weapon if you pack it with explosives and point it at an American ship. Meanwhile, at Naval Air Station Kaneohe in Hawaii, VF-19 was working up for deployment, their brand new F-8F Bearcats painted in glossy sea blue, each aircraft capable of carrying 2 1,000-pound bombs or rockets in addition to their guns, making them effective not just as interceptors but as fighter bombers that could strike Japanese airfields, destroying kamikazes on the ground before they could take off, and the squadron's pilots, many of them combat veterans with kills against Japanese aircraft, knew they had something special, something that would have given them overwhelming superiority in any engagement, if only they could get to the combat zone in time. USS Langley, the light carrier that had survived Pearl Harbor and fought through the entire Pacific War, was steaming westward in August 1945 with VF-19 and their F-8F Bearcats embarked, heading for the Western Pacific where they would join the massive fleet assembling for Operation Olympic, the invasion of Kyushu scheduled for November 1, 1945, and the pilots of VF-19 had been briefed on what they would face, the thousands of kamikazes waiting on hidden airfields, the determination of the Japanese to turn the invasion into such a bloodbath that America would negotiate rather than occupy, and these pilots knew their Bearcats with their 94-second climb to 10,000 feet would be the tip of the spear, the first line of defense against the divine wind. Admiral Matomagaki, commanding the 5th Air Fleet from underground bunkers in Kyushu, had no intelligence about the F-8F Bearcat, no idea that the Americans had developed a fighter specifically designed to counter the kamikaze threat, and his staff continued planning on the assumption that they would face F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs, aircraft they knew well, aircraft whose performance envelopes they understood, whose weaknesses they could exploit by coming in at extreme altitudes or using terrain masking, but the Bearcat would have changed everything, would have made their carefully calculated approach routes death traps, because no Zero or any other Japanese aircraft could escape something that climbed at 4,465 feet per minute and hunted at 421 miles per hour. The German naval attaché in Tokyo, one of the few Axis personnel still communicating between Germany and Japan in 1945, sent a final report before Germany's surrender describing the Japanese preparations for homeland defense, noting that they had assembled approximately 10,000 aircraft of all types for kamikaze use, including museum pieces and trainers, anything that could fly and carry a bomb, and he compared it to the Luftwaffe's final desperate battles over Berlin, when training aircraft and obsolete bombers were thrown against the Soviet Air Force in futile gestures of defiance, except the Japanese were planning something even more extreme, the complete sacrifice of their entire remaining air force in one massive suicide attack. The Italian officers serving with the Allied forces in the Pacific, having switched sides after Mussolini's fall, watched the kamikaze attacks with professional interest, noting how the Japanese had solved the problem of inexperienced pilots by eliminating the need for them to survive their first combat mission, and they remembered their own struggles with pilot training as the war progressed, how the Regia Aeronautica had gone from having some of the world's best trained pilots in 1942, sending boys with barely 100 hours of flight time against American formations in 1943, but even they had never considered suicide as a tactical doctrine, had never reached that level of desperation. On Okinawa, the fighting continued through June 1945, with Marine and Army units slowly grinding through Japanese defensive positions while overhead, Navy fighters struggled to protect the fleet from continued kamikaze attacks, and pilots reported that the quality of the suicide attackers was declining, with many unable to hold formation, some getting lost and attacking empty ocean, others so drunk they could barely fly straight. But even these pathetic remnants occasionally got through and on. June 21st, when organized resistance on Okinawa officially ended, the fleet had suffered more damage from kamikazes than from all other causes combined. A sobering preview of what Operation Olympic would bring. The F-8F Bearcat's bubble canopy, a first for Navy fighters, would have given pilots unprecedented visibility to spot incoming kamikazes, while its lighter weight and more powerful engine meant it could accelerate and climb faster than anything in the Japanese inventory, creating energy advantages that would have been insurmountable in combat, and combat veterans who later flew the Bearcat in peacetime described it as the best handling piston fighter ever built, with controls so responsive it seemed to read the pilot's mind, characteristics that would have been invaluable when intercepting multiple targets in rapid succession during mass kamikaze attacks. Lieutenant Commander Yukio Sato, one of the few experienced pilots still alive in the 5th Air Fleet, privately told his fellow officers that the war was lost, that sending boys to die in obsolete aircraft was murder, not strategy, but he continued training kamikaze pilots because duty demanded it, teaching them the basics of diving attacks while knowing that most would never reach their targets, would be shot down by American fighters whose performance specifications he could only guess at, unaware that the F-8F Bearcat would have made their sacrifice even more futile, turning the sky into a killing field where no Japanese aircraft could survive. The Pratt & Whitney R2834W engine that powered the Bearcat was the culmination of American engine technology. A perfect synthesis of power and reliability that could run at maximum output for extended periods without failing, unlike the increasingly unreliable Japanese engines that suffered from poor fuel quality and inferior metallurgy. And this engine gave the Bearcat not just speed and climb but sustainability, the ability to fly multiple intercept missions without mechanical failure, something the Japanese could no longer count on as their industrial base collapsed under bombing and blockade. August 6, 1945, brought the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, and 3 days later Nagasaki was destroyed, events that made Operation Olympic unnecessary, that saved hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides, and when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, Admiral Igaki led a final kamikaze mission that accomplished nothing except adding to the death toll. While on USS Langley, the pilots of VF-19 heard the news with mixed emotions. Relief that the war was over, disappointment that their magnificent Bearcats would never see combat, would never prove themselves against the enemy they were designed to destroy. The F-8F Bearcat went on to break numerous performance records after the war, with modified versions achieving speeds over 528 miles per hour and setting time to climb records that stood for years, proving what the aircraft was capable of when pushed to its limits, and combat pilots who flew it universally praised its handling characteristics, its incredible performance, its ability to outclimb, outrun, and outfight anything with a propeller, making it clear that had it arrived even 3 months earlier, the final air battles of the Pacific War would have been even more one-sided than they were. In French Indochina, nearly 200 F-8F Bearcats were supplied to French forces fighting the Viet Minh, and these aircraft finally saw the combat they were designed for, proving effective in ground attack roles but never facing the kind of aerial opposition they were built to destroy, and French pilots reported that the Bearcat was superior to anything they had flown during World War II, a quantum leap in capability that would have revolutionized air combat had it arrived in time. But by then the age of jets had begun, making even this ultimate piston fighter obsolete. The Japanese pilots who survived the war and later learned about the F-8F Bearcat's capabilities realized how fortunate they had been that it never reached combat, with one veteran Zero pilot stating that facing Hellcats was bad enough, but something that could climb to combat altitude in 94 seconds would have made kamikaze operations impossible, would have turned every takeoff into a suicide mission with no hope of even reaching the American fleet, and this pilot, who had escorted kamikazes to their targets, understood that the Bearcat would have hunted them down like wolves among sheep, using its superior performance to attack from any angle with impunity. Operation Ketsugo's planners had calculated that 1 in 6 kamikazes would hit their targets during the defense of Kyushu, based on the results at Okinawa where 1 in 9 had succeeded, assuming that mass attacks would overwhelm American defenses, but these calculations didn't account for the F-8F Bearcat, didn't factor in an interceptor that could reach attack altitude faster than their planes could climb, that could chase down and destroy kamikazes before they ever got close to the invasion fleet, and military historians have estimated that Bearcats could have reduced kamikaze effectiveness by 75% or more, saving thousands of American lives. The Grumman F-8F Bearcat represented the absolute pinnacle of piston engine fighter design, the ultimate evolution of concepts that began with the biplane fighters of World War I and culminated in this hot rod of the skies, and its arrival just weeks before Japan's surrender meant it never faced the Mitsubishi A6M0 in combat, never proved its superiority over the aircraft that had terrorized the Pacific in 1941 and 1942, but every performance metric, every test flight, every evaluation made it clear that the Zero, already obsolete by 1945, would have been helpless against this American superfighter that could climb faster than the Zero could dive. The final irony was that both aircraft were designed around the same basic concept, maximum performance for minimum weight, but where the Zero achieved this by sacrificing protection and firepower, the Bearcat did it through superior engineering and more powerful engines, creating a fighter that was not just faster and more agile but also better armed and protected, embodying the American approach to air warfare that emphasized pilot survival as much as aircraft performance, because by 1945, America understood that trained pilots were more valuable than aircraft, while Japan was throwing away both in desperate attempts to delay inevitable defeat. Today, surviving F-8F Bearcats dominate air races and aerobatic competitions, their distinctive shape and thunderous engines reminding audiences of what might have been, of the battles never fought, the victories never won, and when these warbirds climb vertically into the sky, accelerating at rates that still impress modern audiences, it's easy to imagine them hunting kamikazes over the invasion fleet, protecting American sailors from the divine wind, serving as the ultimate guardian angels of Operation Olympic. But history had other plans, and the atomic bomb ended the war before the Bearcat could write its chapter in the story of the Pacific War, leaving us to wonder what might have been if Japan had faced this ultimate piston fighter in the skies over the homeland. The Grumman factory on Long Island continued producing Bearcats until 1949, building 1,265 aircraft that served with 24 Navy squadrons, and these fighters proved their worth in peacetime, setting records and demonstrating American aviation superiority during the early Cold War. But their true purpose, intercepting and destroying enemy aircraft threatening the fleet, was never tested in combat by American pilots, making the F-8F Bearcat one of history's greatest what-ifs, a weapon of war that arrived too late to fight the war it was designed for, a kamikaze killer that never got to hunt its prey over the waters of the Pacific.